Hello, everyone. This is the COVID-19 and the Law series, Voting in the Pandemic. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Robinson. I'm a professor at the SMU Dedman School of Law and one of the co-directors of the Tsai Center for Law, Science, and Innovation. It's my honor to welcome you to our program today. The Tsai Center is an academic center at the law school that focuses on legal issues related to science and technology. This semester, the center is sponsoring a series of talks to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on the legal landscape. Before I introduce our speaker for today, there are a few administrative matters that I'd like to bring to your attention. First, attendees can submit questions to be answered at the end of the session using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Second, the CLE number for this program will be shown at the end of the session and emailed to all attendees tomorrow. Our speaker for today is Professor Grant Hayden. Professor Hayden writes and teaches in the area of corporate governance, voting rights, and labor law. Professor Hayden's articles have appeared in a number of prominent law reviews in the US. He is the author of American Law: An Introduction and Reconstructing the Corporation from Shareholder Primacy to Shared Governance. He teaches election law, employment discrimination, labor law, disability law, and legislation and regulation. Today, he will be talking about legal issues related to voting and the pandemic. Professor Hayden, I will now turn it over to you.
All right. Well, you get me now on the big screen, hopefully. Thanks for coming to this webinar. Thanks to the Tsai Center for inviting me. Talking about voting rights and election law in an election year is always kind of fun because everyone's keyed up for it. And you know, this year it might have a little more of an edge to it since the future of the free world is riding on it, but fun nonetheless. And COVID aside, there are always unique and interesting issues that are revealed during any election cycle. For example, I don't know whether any of you read a couple of weeks ago, a woman in Exeter, New Hampshire, walked in to a voting precinct for one of the primaries, wearing a T-shirt that said "McCain Hero, Trump Zero" on it. And the town moderator who was running the election immediately took her aside and said correctly that shirt might be considered electioneering and that she would need to cover up the shirt or turn it inside out or go home and put on a new shirt. She declined all of these options, immediately took off her shirt and proceeded to vote topless. This actually caught the other voters and poll workers by surprise. But according to the Boston Globe, the town moderator kept his cool and was quoted as saying, "Whatever, just let her go vote." And she did. With the pandemic, you can understand the town moderator's hesitation to intervene in that particular case. And that's because he had a lot of other issues on his mind, as most people running elections do this fall. And just to give you some sense of the scope of what we're dealing with, I wanted to show you this project that MIT and Stanford put together. A COVID election litigation tracker. This is currently, let's see, this morning it was at 343 cases. It is now up to 345 cases. You'll notice they're all organized by state, or I have them organized by state. We can even, just to make this a little more meaningful for most of the people on this webinar. Whoa, look at all those. Go all the way down to Texas, and you can see Texas also has a lot going on. The scary thing about this is not only the sheer scope of the number of COVID-related election lawsuits, but the number of them that say either pending or on appeal, given the fact that we are already in live voting situations in most states and are about to start early voting in Texas next week. So it's no exaggeration to say that COVID has presented tremendous challenges to the legal community and to the right to vote. To give you some sense of the range of kinds of the range of voting rights and the range of election behavior that might be impacted by COVID, or in any case, I wanted to quickly, let's see, go back and show you a slide. So a few of these slides I'm going to share with you, or I'll actually give you information. A few of them are to make sure that I know the system is working, and a few of them are to prevent you from having to stare at me for 45 minutes, which can be quite an ordeal, even with Zoom touch up my appearance turned on. So I wanted to just give you some sense of the scope of what potentially can be going on. When we talk about the right to vote and ensuring equality in voting, we're usually talking about a number of different things, a number of different facets of the right to vote. And each of these facets is essentially necessary to ensuring full equality in voting. None alone are sufficient. And just to give you a sense, one of the things you need in place in order to guarantee equality in voting is having equal access to the slating process. And that just means every group needs the ability to get their preferred candidate or their preferred proposition onto the ballot. And that's a whole process that might get interrupted. Then there's voting rights as the right to participate. And this is voting rights at its most fundamental. Who has the right to vote, and importantly, this year, how they cast their vote, which can have disproportionate effects on different groups. Once you nail that aspect of the right to vote down, you need to still pay attention to some things. You need to pay attention to vote weighting. You need to, in order to ensure full equality in voting, assign equal weights to votes. And we handle this mostly through the one person, one vote jurisprudence. And finally, even if you have equal access to slating, everyone's participating who should be participating, everyone's vote is equally weighted, there's still ways to thwart equal participation by engaging in practices like gerrymandering. And so we look at this final aspect of the right to vote, which is the right to have an equal opportunity to combine your votes with those of other like-minded voters. Now, this year, given the pandemic, we've been focused on two of these four aspects of the right to vote. We've been focused on the participatory right, in particular, how people are able to cast their ballots, and we're focused on the question of vote weighting. Now, the question of vote weighting actually comes up because we're in the midst of a census, and the census is going to determine the final numbers for both reapportionment and redistricting. And that has been plagued by both pandemic-related and political related issues, and some combination of the two. I'm going to hold off on those today, and I'm going to focus instead on how people vote and how the pandemic affects that. Stop share. Yeah, there we go. So when it comes to casting a ballot, this is where the main challenge of the pandemic occurs. And the reason it occurs is the obvious one. We don't want people in close proximity with each other. People don't want to be in close proximity with each other, and we do not want them to be in close proximity to each other. And this is a problem when you begin to consider what a traditional polling place looks like. Traditionally, polling places are these areas that are enclosed areas where you have a lot of people passing through, touching things, which in terms of this pandemic is a recipe for disaster. Now, added on top of that, you have the issue that polling places are oftentimes loaded with people who are at high risk for this particular virus. In the last election, for example, the 2016 presidential election, nationwide, over 1/4 of the poll workers were 71 years of age or older. So you've got enclosed spaces with a lot of people moving through and a relatively vulnerable population in charge of it. And that is what poses the core problem when it comes to pandemics and the elections. So how do election boards and states deal with this? Well, within the polling places, they've dealt with it, and we've seen this happen in the primaries in a relatively straightforward way. They have spaced out the voting machines. Sometimes this means polling voting machines, so you have additional room between the polling machines. You have polling places try to reduce the number of surfaces that people have to touch as they move through the voting process. You have them cleaning. And as I said, the primary gave us some experience with this. Now there's a little bit of, sometimes some of these measures can backfire a little bit, because it turns out if you have fewer poll workers because they're staying at home because they're afraid of getting COVID, and you begin to space out the machines, what that can do is mean it slows everything down. And when everything gets slowed down, you end up getting lines and crowds. And lines and crowds are not only terrible for democracy because people just leave and don't cast their ballot, but they're also terrible in terms of virus transmission. And so there's a give and take in the actual polling process itself. But that's one thing that states have done. A second thing that states have done is they've expanded early voting opportunities. And about 40 states at this point allow early voting. And most states at this point are encouraging early voting. Many have either started early voting for the first time or have expanded it. Texas, to its credit, which is not something I say very often when it comes to voting rights, actually expanded or extended the early voting period for the general election, as it did with the primaries, from about 2 weeks to about 3 weeks. So early voting in Texas is between October 13th and 30th. And of course, expanding early voting or making it available to begin with is the kind of thing that spreads out demand and allows people to socially distance while they cast their ballot. But I didn't want to focus on either of those. The aspect of the election law's response to the COVID problem that I want to focus on is the expansion of voting by mail. And this has been the primary response of most states in dealing with the COVID pandemic. And it's also been the one that's captured the headlines and even captured parts of the debate. If you weren't concentrating on the fly on Vice President Pence's head, you might have heard him again talk about mail-in voting, as he and the president have been doing relatively nonstop. So I'm going to focus on voting by mail. And in doing so, I want to talk about different aspects of it. I'm going to start by giving you a really quick history of voting by mail to try and situate where we are now. I'll talk about some of the variations between states and between the state and federal government when it comes to voting by mail. I'll talk briefly about some of the benefits of voting by mail, although a lot of them are, I think, relatively obvious. And then I'll spend most of my time, I think, talking about some of the challenges that voting by mail presents to our election system. So, history first. Historically, there really wasn't much voting by mail. For long periods of our history, elections meant people going to polling places and casting their ballots on election day. Before the Civil War, I think only Pennsylvania had some sort of absentee balloting system, and it only applied to soldiers. That actually changed. This is the kind of slide that conveys no useful information, but is better than looking at me. That actually changed during the Civil War for the first time, when between 1862 and 1865, 20 northern states expanded voting by mail for soldiers on the battlefields during the Civil War. As you might imagine, this became a partisan issue at the time. The Democrats of the day thought that Republicans, who were largely in charge of the mechanisms of voting, were going to tamper with the results. There were challenges to state expansion of voting by mail. 9 state Supreme Courts heard these challenges to the new laws during the Civil War, which again, only extended voting by mail to soldiers away on the battlefield. And 4 state Supreme Courts actually struck down those state statutes. After the Civil War, there's a little bit of slow growth when it comes to absentee voting or voting by mail. That is, states began a trickle of states began to allow people who were either out of the county or seriously ill to vote by mail, but not that many. The real expansion of voting by mail came within the last 30 or to 40 years. And it was both, where voting by mail was both expanded and regularized in ways that we'll talk about in a minute. I'll talk about in a minute. Now, some of this took place on the federal level. And I can go back to, stop my share. Some of this took place on the federal level. And the main federal statute that deals with this particular issue is the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, with the clever acronym, UOCAVA. In any case, this federal statute applies to both service members and members of their family and eligible voters who happen to be overseas. So these are 2 groups that are out of the country during the election. And what this federal statute does is it sets up a set of deadlines. So it sets up timing requirements and procedures for these people to register to vote and request a ballot, and gives us various deadlines for getting that ballot back in. And it's all boiled down to what essentially is a postcard application. It's relatively straightforward. These procedures are used in all federal elections by law. Now, but they are more generally used in virtually every election because most states, even though they don't have to, have just piggybacked onto these federal regulations. But again, this only covers military voters and expats, essentially, people living overseas. Other than that, voting by mail is covered by state law. It is state law that governs what's going on when it comes to voting by mail or absentee balloting. And so now I want to move on to the variations of what's going on. And essentially, there's been some debate, by the way, in the popular press about voting by mail versus absentee balloting. It's essentially the same process. That is, that difference in terminology is essentially meaningless. But that's not to say that there aren't distinctions in the way that states have handled voting or continue to handle voting by mail. And so let me give you some sense of the range of approaches. There are essentially three approaches to voting by mail that you can see spelled out on this map. The first approach are the states who have universal voting by mail. And these states send a ballot out to every registered voter. There were 5 states, even before the pandemic hit, that had this system in place. And you can see those 5, they're the dark blue ones, well, including Hawaii, which should be dark blue, but it's behind that shaded white area. So, you know, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Hawaii all had universal voting by mail. Once the pandemic hit, we had a number of states move to a universal voting by mail system in response. And those included the 4 states you see in light blue: California, Nevada, excuse me, New Jersey and Vermont, in addition to the District of Columbia, have all moved to universal voting by mail. So that is the first approach to voting by mail. And by the way, Oregon has been universal vote by mail since 1998. So this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. It's certainly for Oregonians. The second approach is the dominant approach, and that is no excuse absentee ballot. And that is the states highlighted in dark green. These 36 states, at least for this 2020 election, allow or will send a mail ballot to any registered voter upon request. That is, you don't have to give any reason. You can just prefer to vote by mail. And in these 36 states, and the 36 states actually include South Carolina, just passed a law about 2 weeks ago that got signed by the governor that turned them from light green to dark green on this map. And they are now one of the 36 states that is a no excuse absentee ballot state. So that's the second approach. Universal, you get it sent to you automatically, no excuse. If you ask for one, you shall receive. The third category of approaches is the excuse required, or on this map, stricter excuse rules for ballot request. We are now down to only 5 states that require some kind of excuse to vote. You can see from this map that Texas is one of them. Not only is Texas one of them, Texas may be alone, although I guess they share this characteristic a little bit with some of the other states, in that they have not only remained an excuse mail-in ballot state, but they have been fighting tooth and nail to beef up those excuses. That is to essentially not make voting easier during the 2020 election. Now, in excuse required states, the states usually have one of a number of excuses that you need in order to vote by mail, to request an absentee ballot. All of them, for example, you can request an absentee ballot if you are out of the county during the election period. Many of them, including Texas, have a requirement or have the option if you are 65 or over. That is an excuse that allows you to request an absentee ballot, which we'll return to in a second. And finally, states oftentimes have, and Texas does as well, as a disability excuse. If you have a disability that makes you unable to get to the polling place, then you're able to. That's an excuse that allows you to vote by mail. There are other reasons why you might be able to vote by mail in these excuse states. If you're in jail, but otherwise eligible to vote, if you're serving jury duty, there's a long list, but the core ones seem to be out of the county, over 65 or have some disability. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Texas's approach to these excuses, especially two of them that have been litigated in the last couple of months, including the last few days. The first excuse that was litigated was the option for those 65 or over to vote by mail, an option not available to those under 65. I can stop the share. You can remember who's doing what. That requirement or that option made available to 65-year-olds, but not to those under 65, was challenged as being a violation of the 26th Amendment. Remember, the 26th Amendment prohibits states from denying or abridging the right to vote on account of age. A federal district court agreed with the plaintiffs in this case, issued an injunction, but about 2 weeks ago, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a panel of the Fifth Circuit, in a 2-1 decision, vacated that injunction because, in its words, the right to vote was not abridged in terms of the amendment unless the state of Texas made it more difficult for people to vote compared to the status quo. So in the court, by the court's reasoning, just conferring a privilege upon certain voters, in this case, the privilege to vote by mail, based on age, does not abridge the rights of others. Now, this was a very strange opinion, and I think you can get a sense of the strangeness when you begin to think about the fact that that deny or abridge language shows up in a lot of places in the US Constitution. The 15th Amendment has identical language, shall not deny or abridge the right to vote on account of race. The 19th Amendment can't deny or abridge the right to vote on account of sex. The 24th Amendment can't deny or abridge the right to vote on account of failure to pay a poll tax. And of course, the 26th Amendment has the same language. So the easy way to see where I think the Fifth Circuit just blew it here was to just reimagine their defining abridge this way in a race case. Imagine, for example, that Texas, the state of Texas tomorrow, decides to expand the list of excuses available to voters in the state of Texas in order to vote by mail. And it expands that list by saying, well, in addition to our already available categories, you can also vote by mail if you're white. I think that you would see that as a problem. I think you would see that as an abridgment of the right to vote on the basis of race. I hope you would. The reason you would see it as such is because the baseline, I mean, the argument would be the same as the argument in age. I mean, the Fifth Circuit, you'd say, look, all we're doing is conferring an additional privilege on the basis of, in this case, race. We're not doing anything to the voting rights of all the rest of our voters. You can see the problems with this. And ultimately, the problem is all of these voting amendments are not operating on a historical baseline. They're operating on an equality baseline, and they're trying to equalize between members of different sexes, people with different ages, et cetera, members of different races. And just when I thought, nobody could blow this worse than the Fifth Circuit, the Seventh Circuit 2 days ago, earlier this week, came out with a decision regarding a similar law in Indiana. If you remember that map, Indiana was also an excuse state. And among their excuses was this: people 65 or over have the ability to vote by mail-in ballot. And the Seventh Circuit, in order to avoid the hypothetical I just gave you, the obvious hypothetical with race, substituting race in for age, avoided it by saying that fiddling with or expanding the absentee ballot system was not a voting rights case at all. So apparently, laws determining in the state of Indiana or other states and spelling out exactly what the absentee ballot procedures do not have anything to do with the right to vote. It's a truly spectacular decision in ways that are bad. So that's one thing the state of Texas has done, is it's defended this particular excuse with a great deal of vigor, and the Fifth Circuit has agreed with them. Texas, you might remember, also took a position when it came to disability and the pandemic. Ken Paxton, maybe when he should have been doing other things, issued an opinion early on that lack of immunity to the coronavirus alone was not a disability that would allow you to vote by mail in the state of Texas. Eventually, that question made its way up to the Texas Supreme Court, which agreed with this position. And so currently in the state of Texas, lack of immunity to coronavirus, which most of us have alone, isn't sufficient to count as a disability, allowing you to check that disability box. But the Texas Supreme Court also made clear that whether you are disabled is always a question that is self-assessed. That is, it may be that lack of immunity alone is not enough to count as a disability, but lack of immunity coupled with some underlying health conditions may very well. And whether you fall into that category is, according to the Texas Supreme Court, up to you to self-assess. So, and the court reaffirmed that it's up to the voter, and that assessment cannot be second-guessed by the state of Texas. So just word to the wise for those of you looking to vote absentee. So these are the variations, right? We've got universal vote by mail, no excuse voting, and then the excuse states, of which Texas is now one of the remaining 5. When it comes to the benefits of voting by mail, some of them are obvious, some of them aren't as obvious. For states that make the decision to move to universal voting by mail, there are actually substantial cost savings. Colorado, when it switched to universal voting by mail, ended up saving its counties about 40% of their election-related expenses, which is, you know, significant amount of savings. Now, those savings only occur when you make that switch complete. In a year like this, the states are actually in trouble, because not only do they need to maintain their current voting system and all the voting machines and all the precincts, but they are also dealing with a larger number of people voting by mail. And so it's actually costing them more in the short term, but long term, it can save you money. Voting by mail tends to be good because it allows voters to take their time in filling out their ballot. This may not be as big of a deal in Texas, although now that there's no straight ticket party, but straight ticket voting for parties, it's going to take you longer to vote. And it's certainly an issue in states that consistently have a number of propositions that are sometimes worded somewhat opaquely on their ballots that you need to fight through, like California. And so being able to sit down and take your time and do some research and vote at home at your leisure is a clear advantage of voting by mail. Voting by mail also increases turnout. And that is a well-studied point at this juncture, with the most recent study I saw coming out just in June. Voting by mail, or making that option universally available or available without excuse, tends to increase turnout 2 to 3%, and increases it even more in low turnout elections, so municipal elections or off-cycle elections. And importantly, voting by mail increases turnout but does not end up favoring either party. And that remains true in every study that's been done so far, that it does not favor either party in the end. And that's true at both the federal level, federal offices, state offices, municipal offices. There is no significant partisan effect. So increasing turnout's great. Now, obviously the turnout point is especially salient this year, because the thinking behind expanding voting by mail is that's the only way some people are going to cast their ballot this year, because they're going to be afraid to come to the polls. But it's also complicated this year. It's complicated because of the pandemic. That is, it's going to be harder to read how much turnout is improved by making voting by mail more readily available, because we're not sure what the appropriate baseline is for a pandemic. We don't have anything to measure it against. It's also complicated this year by politics. And there have been a number of surveys over the summer into August. At this point, about twice as many Democratic voters are planning to vote by mail as Republican voters. About 50% of Democratic voters in the United States are planning on voting by mail, as compared with 25% of Republican voters are planning on voting by mail, which is something that we really haven't seen before. And it's because voting by mail has become so politicized. Now, it's unclear what effect that's going to have on turnout, because it could just mean that more Democrats end up voting by mail and more Republicans end up voting in person, in which case it's kind of a wash, and maybe turnout goes up or goes down. And it still may not have partisan effect, but I think the pandemic and the current politicizing of the issue may change that outcome. All right, finally, or almost finally, well, finally, what are the challenges to voting by mail? And these are the issues that I think have been in the news, and these are the issues that I think you need to keep your eye on going into November 3rd. And I want to talk about three different kinds of issues. I want to talk about some ballot issues, some counting issues, and the potential for fraud. So ballot issues, counting issues, and the potential for fraud. First, ballot issues. Mail-in ballots have slightly higher error rates than votes cast in person. And by error rates, I mean people are slightly more likely to overvote, that is, vote for two choices when they can only be voting for one, in which case their vote is tossed on that particular office. Overvote or undervote, people will forget to vote for the down ballot people, and so you have more errors. But that's not the real ballot issue with mail-in ballot. The real issue with mail-in ballots is spoilage. Ballots that are not counted at all because of some error. And that error is usually user error. It is people making mistakes when they vote by mail. And the most significant reasons why mail-in ballots get tossed are there are signature problems. People oftentimes forget to sign them. People sometimes sign them, but in a way that doesn't match up with their signature. So there's a failure of a signature match, doesn't match their signature on file. Or in many cases, people get them back too late, and so their votes aren't counted. And so whether it's a signature problem or getting the votes in too late, that's the real issue. It's not the minor error issues, it's the spoilage rate issue. How many votes get just tossed? And in states with a fair amount of experience with mail-in ballots, that number is usually less than 1%. Nationwide, the spoilage rate for mail-in ballots is about 1.4%. And those aren't really particularly high rates, although those are significant numbers of ballots. But the real problem has come in the last few months as states expanded voting by mail and more people began to take advantage of voting by mail. because the states doing this and the people doing it are oftentimes doing it for the first time. And so the error rates began to go, the spoilage rates began to go up during the primaries. And you know, the best count I'd seen is there were about 550,000 votes during the primary season over the summer and late spring that were tossed, mail-in ballots that were tossed because there were either signature problems or the ballots were late. So with, you know, so we've got two issues, right? Signature problems and getting the ballot in too late. Now, with signature problems, some states, about 20 states, have a system in place that gives voters notice that there's a problem with their ballot and gives them an opportunity to correct that system. And like I said, about 19 states have a process in place to do this, which means that about 30 or so states don't have that process, and Texas is one of them. And this, of course, is going to be an ongoing problem, not only for this election, but future elections. The states that have really mastered mail-in ballots have a system of notice and opportunity to correct. Otherwise, what happens is your vote gets tossed and you never find out about it. You have no opportunity to correct, which is a problem. The other potential issue, late ballots. A lot of that, a lot of how many ballots end up being late turns on when the ballots are due. And we have quite an array of options among our states when it comes to when your mail-in ballot is due. There are about 28 states that have a rule, and those states are the states, let's see, in dark purple here, and the one, and Louisiana. There are a number of states that have a rule where they will only count mail-in ballots that arrive, so it's a receipt rule, right, before election day, before or on election day. Louisiana, it's actually the day before for bigger precincts, which is a little bit nuts, but most of these states, 28 states, is a received by deadline. If your ballot comes in after November 3rd in these states, it is not counted. The remaining states have something more akin to the mailbox rule. That is, they are looking at the postmark, and they are looking to see whether your ballot is postmarked on or before election day. And then states on the back end have various cutoffs for when they will stop accepting ballots. Most of these states, you have to have your ballot postmarked by election day, and it needs to come in within about the next week. So most states are like that, and actually the federal law that governs overseas ballots, it's about a week later. Those ballots this year are going to be due November 9th. The state of Washington is an outlier in this regard. It's going to be accepting votes that are postmarked by election day up until November 23rd, so they've got a 20-day window. States like Texas is kind of a weird mix. It's only accepting them for one day, and really only accepting those that are postmarked on election day. Otherwise, they have to be in by election day. So Texas is a little bit mislabeled here. It's a little bit of a hybrid state. In any case, those deadlines knock out an awful lot of mail-in ballots. And so those are the ballot issues, right? And the main issue is spoilage. Stop the share. Oh, no, I don't want to go forward. Back. No, not questions. Back. There we go. So that's ballot issues. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is counting issues. And the counting issues are mostly involve the speed or lack of it in counting ballots. Now, how fast states count ballots is not itself a problem. Because from a legal perspective, in a presidential election, certainly, from a legal perspective, there are never results on election night. And there never have been. What we've gotten used to is relying upon media projections that most people in most elections end up watching and end up being able to go to bed on election night and know with some confidence who the winner is. But what this means is that people have come to expect instant results, and they become suspicious if they don't get instant results. Now, the problem with mail-in ballots in this regard is mail ballots can slow down the count. But a lot of it depends upon how states process mail-in ballots. In particular, when can election officials start authenticating the ballots? That is, opening them up and doing the signature check, because that's the process that takes a little bit of time. Counting them doesn't usually take quite as much time, although they're all over the map when it comes to counting them. Now, the issue here, back to the PowerPoint, is that in many states, the states won't even begin authenticating their ballots until election day. And those states here are highlighted in orange, or some of them, it's close of polls on election day, purple. Now, so these states aren't even opening mail-in ballots until election day. And the troubling thing about this is that among these 14 states that do this are included Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, 3 battleground states. And so these 3 battleground states are not even going to be opening their their ballots until election day. And of course, and so that's going to slow down the counting in these 3 states. Now, the governors in each of these states, Democratic governors, have called for the legislatures to expand the period of time backwards, where the election officials can at least begin authenticating these ballots. I believe in Pennsylvania, or was it Michigan? It was Michigan. They were successful in moving it back a day. But in all 3 of these states, Republicans dominate the legislature, and they have been resistant to extending that time. These counting issues, the speed at which these states, especially the battleground states, are going to be able to count their ballots, it's going to be exacerbated, of course, by the sheer number of mail-in ballots that are going to be coming in this year. So that's one of the counting issues, is it's not going to happen as fast, especially in the states that I just mentioned. An additional complication. An additional complication is something that's come to be known as blue shift. And what blue shift means, blue shift describes a phenomenon that we first became aware of in the 2004 election. Prior to 2004, as states counted their late coming ballots, those ballots did not tend to skew results in the direction of one party or the other. And I even remember from Florida 2020 and the fiasco there, we were waiting on the overseas ballots, which could come in late. And the overseas ballot, the military ballots were breaking toward Bush, and the expat ballots were breaking toward Gore, and they, you know, the overseas ballots and the late counted ballots ended up evening out. That has not been true since 2004. Since 2004, as counting continues past election day, Democratic candidates pick up ground, sometimes substantial ground. And those of you paying attention in the 2018 election will remember this. If you remember, when it came to the House races in 2018, on election night, there were like 15 or 20 House races out of the 435 that were too close to call. And so, you know, they were too close to call. And so we had to wait and see what the final count was. And then over the next 2 or 3 weeks, one by one, bang, bang. There were like 10 of these districts in California alone. Every single last one of those too close to call House races broke for the Democratic candidate. And the same thing happened in the Arizona Senate race. The votes broke for the Democratic candidate. And at this point, this is a pretty well-established phenomenon. These, you know, and it ends up being fairly significant. In Pennsylvania, for example, in the last four elections, so 2004 to 2016, the last four presidential elections, the Democratic presidential candidate has netted 20,000 additional votes between the election night count and the final count. Now, you're probably wondering, or I hope you're wondering, if you're paying attention, well, why does this occur? Didn't you just tell us that mail-in ballots don't skew one way or the other? And yes, I did tell you that. And yes, that is still true. It turns out that these late-breaking shifts aren't due to mail-in ballots, they're due to provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are a relatively new thing. After the Florida fiasco in 2000, Congress passed in 2002 the Help America Vote Act. States needed to have, in order to get the money, some provisional balloting system. So if people show up without the proper ID, they're able to cast a provisional ballot that day, and they can later cure that by bringing in their ID, at which point their ballot is counted, right? If people show up, for example, to the wrong precinct, they sometimes can cure that as a defect, cast a provisional ballot, and end up having it counted later after they cure it. And so the people, it turns out that the people who use provisional ballots tend to be young, and they tend to be non-white, and both of those groups skew pretty heavily Democratic. And those provisional ballots are actually the ballots that account for this blue shift. Now, the reason why I think that's an issue this year is it's going to heighten the political takes as these counts take additional time because of the expansion of mail-in balloting, coupled with the fact that some of these key states aren't processing the ballots. And so, you know, not only, and you know, frankly, the fact that disproportionate numbers of Democrats report that they're going to be voting by mail, if those are among the ballots that end up being late counted in some of these states, you're not only going to have the provisional ballots skewing Democratic, but the mail-in ballots skewing Democratic, and the blue shift will turn into a blue surge. Of course, none of this implies that there's anything untoward going on. And in fact, if you remember from 2018, despite all these shifts, most major party members in the Republican Party were not complaining about issues having to do with anyone's count. Finally, so that's the counting issues haunt me, I guess. A final issue, or final challenge, is the potential for fraud. And again, like it comes with as with the counting issues, this is mostly an issue of perception. And to put it plainly, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud that can throw a significant election. And let me explain why that's so. The first thing you need to understand about mail-in ballots is they are, they're essentially the gold standard for election security in some senses. They are hand-marked, hand-signed paper ballots that oftentimes in many states now have a unique tracking number. And so when it comes to dealing or resolving election disputes, that is literally the gold standard. That's what you want. A stack of countable papers that you can check, recheck, argue over, whatever. And that helps ensure that you're not going to get large levels of undetected fraud. Nonetheless, that's not to say there's no voting fraud. It's just exceedingly rare. When it does occur, it tends to occur with respect to absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, as you might suspect, because you know, absentee ballots, unlike regular ballots, are sometimes out of the control of election officials. And the most recent high-profile example of this was there were operatives for the Republican candidate in North Carolina's 9th congressional district in the 2018 election that got caught rounding up ballots and opening them and filling them out differently and turning them in. They were caught. It was significant enough that they ended up rerunning that election. But that is, it's in a way, it's the exception that proves the rule. It's usually relatively easy to catch this kind of behavior. And at this point, it's been studied quite a bit. The most recent and the highest account I've seen of the rate of voter fraud with respect to mail-in ballots is 0.00, I need to get the number of O's right, 0.0025%, which, in some ways seems higher than I would have guessed, although it's the outside high estimate. On the other hand, you have to consider it in relation to the turnout increases. That is roughly 1/1000th of the number of ballots that you gain by moving to an election, because it was between 2 and 3%, and here we're talking about 0.0025%. And so, in comparison with the turnout boom, I think it's no issue. So, bottom line on mail-in votes in a pandemic, I suppose, when it comes to ballot issues, pay attention to the directions, right? And try to ensure that other people are paying close attention to the directions. Some states make it extremely difficult to make sure you do everything right, and they will just toss your ballot if you don't. And you'll never know about it, or you're not given an opportunity to correct in time. When it comes to the counting issues, don't be among those people who expect instantaneous results. And when it comes to fraud, just be very skeptical of claims of widespread fraud. More than likely, as what happened in Pennsylvania about 2 or 3 weeks ago, what's initially reported as fraud oftentimes turns out to be low-bore election administration error, which you have a fair amount of when you're carrying out large-scale elections. So, in sum, I hope there's no election meltdown. I hope the margin of victory exceeds the margin of litigation, which is always something you hope for as an election law attorney, or maybe not, maybe you want the extra work. But that's all I have. Maybe in Q&A, I can talk about, what to keep your eye on election night, given all these variables, but I'll take that up then. And now I will hand it back over to Keith.
All right, thanks, Grant. That was great. So we do have a couple of questions, and I'll try and ask them in the order that they were asked. If you have a question, just chat it, put it into the Q&A. So the first question is asked whether you can say anything about the faithless electors issue.
Yeah, I mean, the issue essentially there is, can electors not go along with their states, vote against how their states told them to vote at the level of the Electoral College? And I don't know if the person who asked this knows this, but even in the last election, there were a number of faithless electors on both Trump's and Clinton's side who deviated from the way they were supposed to. It didn't end up making a difference, which of course allows you to be a faithless elector a little more confidently. So, I don't think faithless electors are going to be a big issue. The thing along those lines that people, I think, are tending to worry about is, what if one of these two candidates gets COVID and becomes incapacitated or drops dead? What are states going to do then? Especially given the fact that we already started voting. There have already been, by the way, more than 5 million votes cast in the United States. A combination of mail-in ballots and early voting periods that are longer than Texas's. So what happens then? Is it just a free-for-all when it comes to the electors? And the answer there is no. Both the Republican National Party and the Democratic National Party have procedures in place for substituting a candidate. Most likely they would substitute with the vice presidential candidate. Now, the bigger question is, what do the states do on their end? Because it's the states that put forward the slates of electors. And unfortunately, there are only like 15 or 20 states that have laws on the books that handle this situation of what happens if one of the candidates, the presidential candidates, becomes ill or dies, right? I guess that's the situation I most worry about, because at that point, some of these states don't have any guidance in their own laws. And so that's going to let the electors give them a little more latitude. And so that's potentially an issue, but faithless electors, I don't know. It's just not something that keeps me up at night. There are a lot of things that do keep me up at night, but about this election, but that's not really one of them.
So I'm gonna ask you if you could advance to the CLE slide,
Sure.
so that the busy attorneys that have to go up and bill can write the number down. But we've got a lot of questions that popped in the Q&A, so we'll continue for a couple minutes here with some questions. So the second question, I'm gonna rephrase it a little bit. It has to do with Governor Abbott's recent proclamation having to do with limiting each county to one drop box. So can you talk a little bit about the process for, if you have a mail-in ballot, mailing that in, do you go to the drop box, and what is the rationale for, what security issues what security issues I'm trying to frame this question. What security issues is the governor trying to address by limiting the number of drop boxes?
I mean, really? God knows. Look, this is, I mean, the background is usually if you have a mail-in ballot, and this is true in states that are even universal vote by mail, you can, of course, mail your ballot in, but you can also usually hand deliver it to a designated location. And Texas, like many other states, has made available these drop boxes, right? You can drop it in. Why you would limit the number of drop boxes to one per county? So you're talking, what, Harris County has how many people in it? 3 million people? I don't know how many people Harris County has in it. If I knew my Texas history or my Texas geography more, I'd be able to name the most sparsely populated Texas county that also has one drop box. I mean, it is ridiculous, but frankly, it's part and parcel of Texas's approach to election law that has been consistent over at least the last 2 decades. And if you want to go back further to the white primary days in the 1920s and 1930s, take it back then. Texas has a reputation for trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. It's one of the reasons why we have some of the lowest turnout rates. The offered reasons usually include promoting ballot security and deterring voter fraud, are flimsy to non-existent. The only reason I'm somewhat hopeful on this front, not with respect to those drop boxes, because the security of having one drop box or 50 drop boxes, you can police they're secure, and you can police the security of all of them. The the thing I'm at least a little bit happy about is lower courts, at least the district courts across the country, are getting better at interrogating states when the states restrict voting based on claims of election fraud or security issues. And as courts have begun to scrutinize those claims, they've very consistently found them wanting. I have seen no there when it comes to expanding the number of drop boxes in terms of fraud. There's no evidence that that increases the amount of fraud, but it is part and parcel with Texas's longstanding approach to make voting more difficult, which
Okay.
explains its turnout rates,
So in a related question, you mentioned the lower court. So this question asks whether they say in Texas, my understanding there's a lawsuit to remove the expanded early voting period. Do you know the status of this lawsuit?
I don't, but I think that ship has sailed. I think it's a little bit too late. I should probably call back up that screen, the COVID election tracker, and see if I can track down. I think I read, might have been this morning or it might have been last night, that lawsuit got rejected, but I don't know where it is on appeal. I'm sorry. But I do think at this point, with early voting set to start next Tuesday, I think that's the 13th, and the fact that Governor Abbott expanded early voting during the primary voting season without any significant problems, I actually don't see that lawsuit going anywhere. Now, never say never when you have the Fifth Circuit and the Texas Supreme Court sitting on top of these cases, but as far as I know, that case has gone nowhere. But
Okay.
yeah, but I could be wrong. So I'm sorry that I don't know the answer to that.
No problem. So we have a few questions that relate to security and activity, I guess, on the day of voting at the polls. And you started your presentation with a very colorful example. And so I was wondering if you could just talk generally about, are there any concerns about security at the polls, unauthorized poll watchers, things of that nature?
I don't think there's worries about security at the polls. I mean, I'm hoping that poll demand and it is spread out with that 3-week early voting period, and that many of the ballots will be cast well before Election Day, I hope, because spreading out demand in that sense is good, I think, from everyone's perspective, poll workers and voters both. Poll watchers, most states have restrictions on who can watch polls. Most allow bipartisan teams to be in attendance, but there are rules that pretty strictly require what they can do. Am I worried that random armed people aren't going to show up outside the polls and try to intimidate voters? Yeah, I guess I'm vaguely worried about that, especially given the fact that the president has essentially issued a call for such behavior. I'm hoping that people do not actually do that. That's not my big worry. In particular, anyway, that's not my big worry, which I guess begs the question, what is your big worry? But I'm not going to answer.
Well, yeah, what is your big worry?
Well, I think the thing you have to keep your eye on the night of the election, given everything I mentioned about when states count, and I'm not a political scientist, so this is a combination of what I read in the polls plus what I know about how the states are going to be handling their ballots. I think if you watch Florida, Florida has a lot of experience with mail-in ballots. Florida authenticates their mail-in ballots up to 22 days before election day as soon as they get them, and they actually count them. They don't announce the count until after polls have closed, but they begin counting them early. So the number that comes out of Florida ought to be a pretty good number. That is, you're not going to see that number move a lot after election day. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, for the reasons I talked about, you're going to see those numbers shift. If Florida breaks, and this is the political science end of it, right? I understand that Trump's path to victory almost certainly has to include Florida. So if Florida were to break for Biden decisively, or even not decisively, but in a way that isn't a Bush v. Gore kind of repeat, then I think everything will calm down. If it doesn't, then what I'm worried about is there's going to be a lot of yapping about fraud and a lot of undermining the confidence in electoral systems that we should be perfectly confident in, which includes counting that goes well past election day, especially in these states that can't even open their ballots until election day. So I guess I'm worried about the chaos that might occur given people's perceptions of what's going on. And the Department of Justice just changed its position. They're going to start announcing all their election-related investigations, which from time immemorial, they were prohibited by internal guidance from doing because it undermines confidence in the elections. So anyway, so that's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the kind of electoral meltdown that happens if Florida breaks for Trump. And I'm not trying to be political about it. It's just, that's how you read the polls, right? If Florida breaks for Trump, then the election becomes closer. Unfortunately, that throws it in the hands of these states where there are going to be issues, not fraud issues, but slow counts, So that's what I worry about.
So let's take one more question. Again, I'm going to try and summarize a number of questions. So a number of folks seem to be concerned about the security of mail-in ballots once they leave their hands. So the security of these ballots in the mail system, and there have been some examples of the interception of these ballots, et cetera. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what does the data tell us about the possibility for that, and what is the best way if you are voting by mail to ensure that your vote, or what can you do to ensure that your vote reaches the right people?
Yeah, well, I mean, by far and away, the biggest problem there is going to be user error. You forgot to sign, you forgot to put it in the security sleeve in some states. You forgot to get it postmarked by the right date. So, the first thing I tell those people is that it's much more likely that something is going wrong on your end than something is going wrong after it leaves your hands, at least statistically speaking. So just be careful about how you do this. Have there been cases where, mail carriers lose the mail or do something crazy? Yeah, there have been a few cases like that, but they've been really few and far between. If you're worried about your ballot getting in on time, I would say take it to a Dropbox, or be sure and mail it in sufficiently early. One thing I didn't mention was states have different amounts of play in the system between the last date you can ask for an absentee ballot and the date that it's due. And Texas has a relatively tight turnaround time. That is, you can request an absentee ballot pretty late in the game, which means you're going to request it, you're going to get it, and you're not going to have a lot of time to get it in on time. So I think one thing you can do is take care of it early. Other than that, you can use a Dropbox if you really lack confidence in the mail system. But by and large, these states that have had universal mail-in ballot, and these are both Republican and Democratic states. I was just listening to the lieutenant governor of Utah, who runs their election system there, who's actually running for governor now, just extolling the virtues, much to the chagrin, I think, of some of his national Republican counterparts, of how well their vote by mail system works, how secure it is, how confident he is in it. So I don't come at this mail-in ballot thing from a partisan end. I think people who study it and people who actually people who study it and people who are involved in processing and setting up these systems are pretty confident in them. As is, by the way, the national intelligence community. Despite what President Trump has been consistently, I think, disparaging mail-in balloting, but his intelligence community, as recently as yesterday or 2 days ago, tried to reassure people that they think our election system, including the vote by mail system, is by and large secure. So I would say, don't worry that much about the stuff that you can't worry about. If you are, I guess, take it to a drop box or try to vote in person during early voting when there aren't that many people there. On the other hand, make sure you're dotting all your I's and crossing your T's and getting it in on time.
Right. Worry about what you control. That's good universal advice.
Right, but also don't be overly worried even about the stuff you can't in this case. Yeah. Right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Grant, for this.